Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Toby Dershowitz, Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Strategy at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome. FDD is a nonpartisan research institute exclusively focused on national security and foreign policy. We have 3 centers of excellence in the areas of military and political power, economics and financial power, and cyber and technology innovation. We do not accept funds from foreign governments. Iranian penetration into Latin America has been a challenge for decades for those concerned about regional stability, financial integrity, rule of law, human rights issues, and our own national security. It's also challenged those in the region who want to see democratic institutions as the foundation for their societies. And this goes beyond voting booths and extends to issues that are addressed in everyday life, like transparency and accountability. FDD is pleased to host today's event that looks at the Islamic Republic of Iran's malign activities in the region. For reasons that will become even more clear as the event unfolds, it could not be more timely a conversation. Our panelists today have unique vantage points that will help us delve into the challenges. They will talk about where our respective governments have done well, where they have fallen short. I want to mention that FDD does not take a position on electoral politics, but we hope today's conversation will shed light on important issues posed by Iran's malign activity in the region. Our first speaker is the Honorable Carlos Paparoni. Mr. Paparoni served as the Presidential Commissioner Against Corruption and Terrorism for the Venezuelan interim government. Today, he is the leader of Primero Justicia, or Justice First, a Venezuelan political party. He is a member of the Venezuelan Parliament's National Assembly. Mr. Paparoni was one of the State Department's 2021 Anti-Corruption Champion awardees. The State Department said Paparoni produced financial intelligence and analysis that proved essential to constricting the illicit financial flows of the Venezuelan regime. He is known for his outspokenness when it comes to corruption, and as a lawmaker who has led several investigations into corruption and organized crime tied to the Nicolas Maduro regime. He has done this at great personal risk to himself and to his family. And while he could not be with us in person today, it's a real honor to have him share his thoughts with us on this topic today.
Para entender la relación entre Irán y Venezuela, es necesario entender que esta relación ha sido mucho más que una alianza diplomática que se tejió durante el gobierno del presidente Hugo Chávez, que ha sido más que apoyo logístico a grupos subversivos y terroristas como lo es Hezbollah, donde uno de los operadores fundamentales fue el encargado de negocio en la embajada venezolana en Siria, Ghazi Nassereddin, quien hoy está signado a través de la FARC como miembro de este grupo terrorista. Es importante resaltar que no solamente son esos acuerdos militares para drones artillados no tripulados que se han estado construyendo en Venezuela y que cada vez más vemos imágenes de estos drones en desfiles militares de Nicolás Maduro. Es importante resaltar que no es solamente la operación de intercambio de petróleo y de violación de sanciones a través de este intercambio, sino lo que hemos visto y lo que nos muestra el avión detenido en Argentina el pasado 6 de junio, es que la relación entre Irán y Venezuela logísticamente se ha ido estrechando muchísimo más. Hablamos de un avión donde parte de sus tripulantes, no los iraníes, sino los venezolanos, tienen una connotación importante en cuanto a la confianza que gozaban de parte del régimen venezolano. Hablamos de una tripulación que contaba con más de 5 integrantes siendo militares, en los cuales figura el capitán Cornelio Antonio Trujillo Candor, quien figuró en el golpe de Estado con el presidente Chávez de 1992 y quien hasta la muerte de Hugo Chávez estuvo en su principal círculo de confianza. Hablamos de Jorge Gabriel Pérez López, con pasaporte diplomático, pero con múltiples viajes hacia Cuba, Santo Domingo, Estados Unidos y, por supuesto, Irán y Rusia. Hablamos de Carlos Ramón Anselme Merchán, funcionario de los organismos de seguridad y de inteligencia de Nicolás Maduro, quien contaba con un pasaporte diplomático, miembro del PSUV y que, oh sorpresa, tenía múltiples viajes a Cuba, Irán, Nicaragua, quien además voló para el fiscal de Nicolás Maduro, Tarek William Saab, y quien fue en un viaje de Rusia a Venezuela transportando a la seguridad, a la Guardia de Honor Presidencial, quien es la seguridad de Nicolás Maduro. Hablamos de Emilio José Salazar Velázquez, militar venezolano de la Fuerza Aérea Venezolana, quien además es un piloto de élite. Hablamos de Mario José Árraga Urdaneta, con pasaporte de servicio y quien siendo militar estuvo adscrito durante mucho tiempo a funciones de inteligencia. Y de Víctor Manuel Pérez Gómez, con pasaporte de servicio, pero que además ha realizado múltiples viajes a personas doble nacionalizadas, como venezolanas y como sirios, libaneses e iraníes. Hoy vemos que todos estos funcionarios contaban o tienen una condición importante en la similitud. Uno, son funcionarios de seguridad o militares, y dos, todos ellos contaban con pasaportes de servicio o pasaportes diplomáticos que los acreditaban como funcionarios de confianza de hoy el régimen de Nicolás Maduro. Hoy lo que creemos y lo que nos da como relacionadas entre Entrasur y Mahan Air, que además vale resaltar que esta aeronave Boeing 747 no cuenta con ningún documento de transferencia o de compra y venta, es que Entrasur o Venezuela comienza también a ser una mampara para las actividades logísticas de Irán y de los grupos relacionados a ellos en todo nuestro continente.
Thank you, Deputy Paparoni. And now let me turn to our other three outstanding panelists who are here with us in Washington, D.C. on our stage. First, the Honorable Ricardo López Murphy, who is a member of Argentina's parliament. He previously served as Minister of Defense and Minister of Economy and has been instrumental in demanding that Argentina's intelligence services determine why an IRGC, an Iranian Revolutionary Guardsman, would be piloting a routine cargo flight into Argentina. More on that later. We're also pleased to have with us Mariano Federici, a Senior Managing Director at K2 Integrity. Mariano is a leading expert in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. He has also served as head of Argentina's Financial Intelligence Unit, an FIU, during which time he held numerous international positions at global AML and CFT organizations. Mariano has also worked as senior counsel for the International Monetary Fund's legal department. And finally, I'm very delighted to be joined by my colleague Emanuele Ottolenghi, a senior fellow here at FDD and an expert at FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, focused on Hezbollah's illicit activities in Latin America. A warm welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me begin with you, Congressman. Mr. Paparoni spelled out how Iran has had nefarious influences in his country, a country he is hoping will not succumb, as he said, to having his country turn into a homeland for an Iranian military base, right? He has said that in the past. But before we talk about Iranian penetration into Argentina, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on Mr. Paparoni's remarks. And what concern do you have first about having a neighboring country be so influenced by Iran?
The truth is, in Argentina, we have been very worried about this development, not only because Venezuela is a country where there is almost a country gangsters government, in the sense they are very linked to organized crime, but also because of the relation of Venezuela with Iran and with other countries that, well, are against the open society, to mean something more than the liberal democracies. From that point of view, in Argentina, we are very worried because we suffered two of the biggest terrorist attacks that any country in the world suffered from Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, as you know, depends on Iran. Both things and the cooperation with Venezuela. Remember that last time Maduro from Tehran congratulates our president because he speaks in favor of Venezuela in Los Angeles meeting. And well, for a long period of time, I have been against this type of political organization and political alliance. And the risk is not only because of the narrative against open societies, but the risk is also because we suffer two terrorist attacks. I want to point out this because it explains more than other thing my behavior. The attack were in my city. I am member of the Congress for my city. It's in the neighborhood of my home. It's something that we suffer deep in our heart, and we will be ready to do things that perhaps are, you require a lot of courage to do, but it's necessary for our life and for our freedom.
Are there ways that Iran has used Venezuela to influence Argentina in a way that concerns you?
Well, Venezuela is linked to Cuba, to Iran, and there's this relationship is very dangerous for the argument I gave before. The case that we are facing now show you very clearly the cooperation between them. Mm-hmm. The flight was hired in Querétaro, Mexico, has to fly to Argentina, but went to Caracas, incorporate more people into the plane. The plane was a cargo plane with 19 people aboard, and that is something that worried me a lot. And the truth is, finally, this type of behavior between Venezuela, Iran, and the government of Argentina worry me a lot.
Thank you for that. And we're going to get into the details of the plane that's, as we speak, grounded. But before we get to that, Mariano, let me ask you, could you reflect on Mr. Paparoni's comments and also the Congressman's comments? Zooming out 30,000 feet, what concerns you about Iranian penetration into Latin America?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. I couldn't agree more with what the Congressman just described. I think we're facing here a threat not only to the democratic stability of our societies, to our individual freedoms, to the open and free societies, as the Congressman described it, but also a threat to the national security of our countries and to global peace and security, to be honest, as well. Sometimes the risks that we experience in our part of the world may materialize as dangers and concrete acts of terror in our latitudes, but sometimes they may also be related, connected with attacks that take place elsewhere. We know that Latin America has been fertile ground for Hezbollah's financing operations, for executing attacks in other parts of the world. That is why what happens in South America should be of deep concern, not only to Latin American countries, but also to the entire world. It's a threat to global peace and security. I think this alliance between Iran and Cuba, Venezuela, also Nicaragua. Let's not forget that in the latest assumption of Ortega Murillo, we had one of the suspects of the AMIA attacks attending the inauguration. Mr. Rezai was standing there next to Ortega.
The AMIA attack is the second terrorist attack.
Second terrorist, exactly. So let's not forget that we have here 3 dictatorships in Latin America that are opening the doors, are opening the gateways for a deeper penetration than we have seen before. I'm also worried with the inclination of some of Latin American democracies to more populist, autocratic type of governments that find, let's say, empathy or sympathy towards these dictatorships with deep anti-American sentiments that make it very attractive for Iran also to import the export of its revolution, let's say, which basically means a serious threat to our nations and to our people.
And contrasting it with just, say, 20 years ago, post 9/11, you see the trend moving in the wrong direction.
Correct, because at the time of 9/11, let's remember, we only had one dictatorship in the region, whereas all the rest were democracies. There were many countries aligned also with the importance of democratic values and free markets and open society. Unfortunately, the trend in the region is going in the wrong direction, in an opposite direction now. And that makes it more attractive for autocratic regimes, for dictatorships to find ways to penetrate deeper into our societies and alter our way of living.
I think it also makes a compelling case as to why this is such an important issue. It's not something we can just take for granted. I want to just pick up on one thing that you said. I mean, you headed up the Financial Intelligence Unit in Argentina at the time that Hezbollah was designated a terrorist entity. It was actually on the 25th anniversary of the bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Argentina. Help us understand, what was the reason that Argentina ended up designating Hezbollah? What trends did you see? What was the most important reason that happened? Why did Argentina think it was so important to do that?
So we promoted that designation. My office promoted that designation, which was supported by the government of President Macri and allowed us to become the first country in Latin America to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. The rationale was, first of all, we assessed that the threat of Hezbollah and Iran in our country had been irresponsibly underestimated by previous governments, particularly by the 2 previous governments of the Kirchners in Argentina that had even gone as far as entering into a deal with the Iranian government. So we began with an assessment of the threat, working cooperatively with other countries, particularly with the U.S. government, with whom we entered into a dialogue called the Argentina-U.S. Dialogue on Illicit Finances. This allowed us to conduct fact-finding missions, to conduct deep assessments of the level of the current threat. And we identified and confirmed the presence of elements related with Hezbollah, particularly in the tri-border area that unites our country with Brazil and Paraguay. So we were faced here with a situation. Not only was Hezbollah and Iran a threat related with the past in Argentina, 2 terrorist attacks, as the congressman described, but also a current and prospective threat to our national security, our financial integrity, and to global peace and security. So we felt it was time to act. A lot of years collecting intelligence, collecting information. Intelligence must be collected to act upon at a certain moment. We felt the time had come. We made a proposal to designate this organization because the designations are the modern means of mitigating these risks and preventing these threats to materialize. Think of it this way, Toby. Up until the designation, there was nothing that would turn it illegal for Hezbollah to actually move money from or to Argentina, because it was not considered a terrorist organization for our country. Now it is. It is publicly registered as such. along with its leadership. So any transaction connected to it should and would be considered as terrorist financing.
Emanuele, you have done a tremendous amount of research on Hezbollah's illicit activities in Latin America. And I want to stay with Hezbollah for a minute, and then we'll come back to Iranian activities. But what does it actually look like on the ground? What does Hezbollah's illicit activity look like in the tri-border area, as Mariano mentioned?
Hezbollah became the main player within the Shia community in Lebanon very early on during the Civil War, soon after the establishment of the Islamic Republic. It was an extension, really, of the Islamic Republic. Its first cadres were trained by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The ideology of Hezbollah embraces the ideology of the Islamic Republic and pledges allegiance to the leader. And one of the ways that they established, cemented, spread their influence in Lebanon over the years was through the building not just of a powerful, effective militia with a terrorist extension overseas, but also with cultural, religious, social, economic, health institutions that catered to the community in exchange for loyalty. And when you move to South America or other places in the world where you have Shia expatriate communities, Hezbollah basically from the very start took the Lebanon model and exported it and reproduced it in miniature fashion wherever these communities were to be found. Now, the tri-border area is a perfect example of that. You have a community of Shia Lebanese expatriates. Most of them arrived between the 70s and the 1980s, so much later than most of the Lebanese immigration to Latin America, which predates actually the establishment of Lebanon, which was mostly Christian. In this case, it's Shias who come out of Lebanon. Many of them come out already during the Civil War. They have already been radicalized and joined either Amal or Hezbollah. They arrive to the tri-border area. They insert themselves into an economy that is driven by illicit activities, contraband, counterfeit merchandise, and so on. And Hezbollah arrives and establishes the same very structure it has in Lebanon. Mosques, schools, scouts movements, charitable organizations. And it also inserts, of course, within the community, a small but important number of senior operatives from the external security organization, what some people refer to as the military wing of Hezbollah, who can control the community, who can extort the merchants, who can cajole people into joining. But over time, the presence of these institutions, the clerics are Hezbollah, the scouts instructors of Hezbollah, the school curriculum in the school is Hezbollah. You walk into the school and you have the portraits of Khomeini and Khamenei in the schools. The mosque is named after Khomeini. It has his portrait in it, and it is a Hezbollah mosque. So over time, these structures, which by the way you find in Macau, Colombia, another hotspot, Colombia, of Hezbollah presence, you find in the Marcory Mosque in Abidjan in the Ivory Coast. So this is a model that they have adopted and exported all over the world wherever Shia expatriates are to be found, to conquer the communities and their loyalty. And of course, this builds on deeper ties that exist, more primordial, of clan, of village of origin, of marriage, of kinship, that allow each and every one of these nodes around the globe to be connected, and these networks are based on all of the above. So that's what Hezbollah has done. And the tri-border area, as I said, was already a center of illicit finance. Porous borders, one key element. Another key factor, which touches upon what my two colleagues were saying before, the widespread corruption, one of the cancers of Latin America, which has undermined the efforts of democracies to establish themselves and has played into the hands of organized crime and terror financiers, is corruption. These networks thrive on their ability to buy off officials to turn the other way. So These networks have established themselves, they have colonized the communities, they have ensured their loyalties, and then they have built leaders in the community who buy influence and access with local politicians. And in some cases, they themselves run for politics or acquire honorific titles such as honorary consuls with all the diplomatic immunities that come along with them to be able to engage in illicit activities. And the result is that when they are present in places like the TBA or Colombia, where you have, or Venezuela, where you have an enormous amount of illicit financial criminal activities going on with billions of dollars a year moving and requiring money laundering services, these communities become critical and converge and cooperate with the local criminal syndicates. And that's where their strength lies. They're indispensable for crime, they control the community, they are plugged into the political systems, and that's why they manage to raise funds and they perpetuate the problems that exist in the region as a consequence.
That was a great description of what's actually happening on the ground, what it actually looks like. The congressman mentioned that there were 2 bombings in Argentina, 2 terrorist attacks, and I think it behooves us just to remind our listeners that together more than 100 people were killed in both of the attacks.
114.
Pardon?
114.
114. And you know, we're talking about the connection between Hezbollah and Iran, Hezbollah being the sort of proxy of choice for Iran. Alberto Nisman, the special prosecutor who investigated the Amia bombing for the better part of a decade, issued several exhaustive reports, thousands and thousands of pages long, where he described in quite granular detail how Iran recruited and radicalized the local population. First, he came into Argentina as sort of as the representative for the Ministry of Meat, and then he became head of a mosque, and then he became the cultural attaché at the embassy, at the Iranian embassy in Argentina, where he had diplomatic immunity. And I mention this because I wanted to sort of pull on that thread. It was people like Mohsen Rabbani, who has an Interpol red notice in connection with the bombing of the Amia. It was people like Mohsen Rabbani who they used to radicalize the population, right? And you know, one of the things that Nisman did is he also described not only how people like Rabbani radicalized the local population, but how Iran used its own embassy in Argentina and in other places in Latin America to help plan the bombing of the Amia. And with that, Emanuele, you talked about how Hezbollah uses front companies. I want to ask, do we know something about how Iran uses front companies to engage in illicit activity? And I just want to touch on that for a moment because I want to tie it to the next question that I have for you.
No, that's a great question. And of course, you know, the model that Hezbollah uses is a model that Iran also developed. You mentioned very correctly Rabbani. He was kind of the bridgehead, the forefront of this operation. He was the first cleric sent to Latin America by Iran with the specific task of spreading the revolution, as Mariano said. And he did what he did in Argentina. It was not the only one. When you go around Latin America today, you discover that what Rabbani did in Argentina, arrive under the guise of being a meat inspector, then sort of take over a mosque, then start the work of bringing the secularized Shia Lebanese and others and Syrians to embrace the ideology, become radicalized, and then spread the network to actually convert local Latin American Christians and to become Muslims on the basis of a radical ideology, is something that Iran has done pretty much in every country in Latin America. And the 2 key figures involved in this project, by the way, are an Argentinian Lebanese who came back to religion through Rabbani, trained in Lebanon and then in Iran, and is now responsible for establishing centers and recruiting people, and Rabbani's son-in-law, who is an Iranian cleric. So you have an operation that today has centers in Colombia, in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Panama, in Costa Rica, in Cuba even, a country that is not usually friendly to religious and missionary activities, all sponsored, financed, supported by Iran. And what we see is that this soft power activity has been used, not just in Argentina, to send, for example, meat inspectors with visas all over the region. The Southern Cone is a great producer of high quality meat that it exports all over the world. The halal market, 2 billion Muslims wanting halal meat around the world. So there is a good cover to do that, but these are agents oftentimes that come in under the guise of inspectors. And that leads also to the establishment of businesses that ostensibly are just involved in the trade and certification of halal meat, but oftentimes transcend that, ostensibly benign purpose and are involved in illicit activities alongside the charities and the cultural centers that are also conveyor belts potentially for illicit financial activities.
And I thought that this would be an important backdrop to talking about the elephant in the room. As we sit here today, there is a Boeing 747 on the tarmac at Buenos Aires International Airport. And as has been sort of mentioned here briefly, but just for the audience's knowledge, this is a plane that seemed to be, or that positioned itself as a regular cargo plane. Talk, Emanuele, about what was suspicious about this plane and why what was suspicious about the plane? I'll leave it at that.
Well, so for most people, the story starts on June 6, when the plane tries to land in Buenos Aires. There is fog, dense fog, can't land. It's diverted to Cordoba. By the time it comes back to Buenos Aires, the plane has not enough gasoline to continue its onward journey. It's bringing cargo. The plane remains stuck for 2 days in Buenos Aires, then tries to leave, and by then it is heading to Uruguay to refuel, but the Uruguayan government blocks its airspace. The plane comes back to Buenos Aires. The crew descends for, I think by then, the third or fourth time and checks into a hotel. There are 5 Iranians and 14 Venezuelans on board, and investigation begins. But the backstory is that this aircraft arrived in Paraguay on May 13th, 2022, 3 days after the foremost anti-corruption, anti-organized crime, anti-narcotics prosecutor of Paraguay, Marcelo Pecci, was assassinated during his honeymoon on a beach in a private resort in Cartagena, Colombia, just in front of his wife. And it was a highly sophisticated operation carried out by a team of hired Colombians and Venezuelans, potentially linked to the Cartel del Golfo, an organized crime based there, but commissioned by somebody in Paraguay. So 3 days later, the plane arrives, and this plane is arriving empty. It belongs to a newly established cargo airline subsidiary of Conviasa, the Venezuelan state airline that is sanctioned by the United States. The plane used to belong to Mahan Air, the Iranian ostensibly private airline sanctioned by the United States for over a decade of material support to the IRGC Quds Force, transporting militias and weapons to Syria, more recently managing Fars Keshem Air, another airline transporting weapons to Syria and to Russia. So something already highlighting a cooperation between Venezuela and Iran in a cargo operation that looks anomalous. And why is that? Because in both cases, a plane that should usually be operated by a crew of 4 or 5 people had 18 in Paraguay and 19 in Argentina. And when they arrive in Paraguay, the 18 members of the crew are flying an empty plane to pick up cigarettes produced by the former president of Paraguay, perhaps the foremost contraband man of cigarettes in the entire Western Hemisphere, just sanctioned recently by the United States for being significantly corrupt. And the crew does not stay on the ground just for the time necessary to pick up the cargo and fly, but they stay there for 3 nights. And nobody knows what they're doing, but they're there 3 days after the assassination of Pecci, and the people on board are not just pilots and mechanics and logistics operators. They are senior members of both the Iranian and the Venezuelan regime. The Paraguayans do nothing. They just leak the information to the press, and that's how we find out initially about this plane. The plane goes back to Caracas after delivering the cigarettes in Aruba, starts flying around again, but then it shows up in Buenos Aires. It's low on fuel, and I think that's where the public story begins, because at that point, someone in Argentina realizes here we have senior Venezuelans and senior Iranian officials, foremost among them the captain of the plane, Gholamreza Ghasemi, former CEO of Iran Naft Airlines belonging to the Ministry of Petroleum, later named Taban Airlines, member of the board and shareholder of Keshem Fars Air, implicated in the logistic operation that Iran has been running for years in Syria, so involved in material support for the IRGC, linked to Midair, and just too senior to be a pilot, although he is a pilot. It's a bit like getting Jeff Bezos to drive around prime Amazon trucks for deliveries for 2 months. It just makes absolutely no sense. The size of the crew, the quality and value of the cargo, the amount of days that each time the plane stops on the ground, none of it suggests this is a purely commercial operation. And the question is still not answered. What are they doing there?
Yeah. I mean, you gave us a lot of details, and there are even more details that you wrote about in a piece in the Dispatch, which I encourage everybody to read. It has a lot of twists and turns. Congressman, I want to ask you, when was the first time you learned about this suspicious plane? And do you have any reason to believe that Venezuela asked Argentina not to inspect the plane?
First of all, I discovered, like the other congressman, after Uruguay rejected the landing of the 747 in the international airport. After that, we discovered the problem. They have been in Argentina for many days. Well, with the information we have, why Uruguay reject them, and the number of people in the plane, and all the circuit they did, and the other reason that I pay attention was our all providers were not ready to feed the cargo because they were under sanction. And with all these elements that perhaps were not too more, we decided to go to the justice and denounce them. And the judge and the prosecutor began to look for information. The explanation of the government officer were not satisfactory, to say the least. They said were homonymous, or they were teaching how to fly the Venezuela people, the Iranian.
That's why they needed an IRGC person. That's what you said, right?
Yeah.
Just so our audience understands, there was an IRGC pilot, and it was his job to train the regular cargo crew how to fly. Okay.
Well, that is unbelievable for us, and well, we with other members of our society make the demand for justice, and the judge and the prosecutor react to that in the right way and ask, maybe we made mistake, our service of justice made mistake in the process, but we ask for information what they are doing, and knowing that if Uruguay received the information, the Paraguay received the information about the plane and about the flight, we cannot have not received a warning. And for that reason, we ask the judge to find out what has happened. The truth is, in a sense, we were not with a lot of information. But if you put together all the things we know, and as one of the members of the panel said, we know the problem in the three countries border, and we knew that there has been happening things that are not very beneficial for our countries. For all that reason, we went to justice, and the process is going on.
The process is going on. Mariano, I want to sort of look at this issue of the plane through a slightly different lens. The Wall Street Journal's Mary O'Grady covered the cargo plane crisis about 2 weeks ago. And O'Grady writes, and I'm going to quote from it, O'Grady writes that material used for military cyber defense operations was found on the plane. Argentina's leaders, she writes, may be part of the problem. And yet Argentina, strapped for cash, is lobbying hard in Washington for a new $500 million loan from the Inter-American Development Bank, and that's an unconditional loan. O'Grady continues, Argentina's lousy debt service record is one reason not to turn over the money. A second and perhaps greater reason, she says, is the reason has to do with the Venezuelan flagged plane parked on the tarmac at Buenos Aires airport, and she goes on to describe that. And then she writes, if Argentina is playing footsie with Iran, that ought to be of interest to the U.S. Treasury Department. The U.S. owns 30% of Inter-American Development Bank and wields power over bank loan disbursements. Credit rating agencies and auditors hold it accountable. It has to absorb losses when borrowers fail to repay. That looks at this issue really through a whole different lens. Talk a little bit about that. Should something like the plane scandal or the plane crisis be a consideration when it comes to loans Argentina is requesting? What, in fact, are requirements that some of the international financial institutions have when loaning money to countries?
Well, absolutely. I think there is no doubt that international financial institutions have to give, have to conduct an analysis on the risks of financial integrity that may be involved in a country that is going to be a recipient of loans. There are policies, there are procedures within mostly all international financial institutions these days related with governance, with anti-corruption issues, and with financial integrity, anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing issues. So the case of the plane, which may very likely fit into a potential terrorist or terrorist financing operation, if we understand terrorist financing as providing material support, any kind of material support to a terrorist organization, and we have here clear links that there were people in those planes, in the plane connected with terrorist organizations and with terrorist activities. There is a potential for charges related with terrorism financing, and I think that's something the prosecutor is exploring seriously in the case. Well, certainly then an international financial organization deciding on whether or not to provide a loan has to assess these elements. I frankly think that international financial institutions here in Washington, D.C., particularly the IMF and the development banks, have not really lived up to that challenge very seriously up to now. But this week, we had a new precedent, I think, a new development, which was the decision of the IADB's president, Mauricio Caron, to deny the $500 million loan to Argentina on the basis of risks to financial integrity, as Mario Grady had anticipated. And I think
Is that precedent setting? Should it be a precedent?
I think it should be. I think it definitely is. I think it has shaken the IFI community. Many of the bureaucrats may not know how to handle or approach this in terms of the policies and procedures. But if the policies and procedures do not allow clearly for this to happen at a particular IFI, then there is a problem with the policies and procedures, because taxpayers' money, the funds that are handled by international organizations should not be provided to governments that do not take these issues seriously. This plane, I'd like to go back to the involvement of Argentine authorities in connection with it, was authorized to land in Argentina. When a plane lands in a country, it has to present a flight plan, and it's authorized. It was authorized by the civil aviation authorities of our country to land in our country. It was the crew was authorized to enter our territory. They were stamped on their passports. They were allowed to roam freely for 48 hours in our city, the city of Buenos Aires, and perhaps in other places. We don't know where else they moved around during those 48 hours. And then they were authorized to leave. All of this was done with official authorizations of the Argentine government. Whether the Venezuelans asked the government...
You say they were allowed to leave. They haven't left yet as of...
They were allowed to take off and depart Argentina.
The plane was allowed to.
The plane was allowed with the crew. Mm-hmm. They were not successful in their attempt because of the Uruguayan government prevented them to fly into their airspace, and they were not able to refuel, so they did not have the sufficient fuel capacity to make their way back. But had it not been for the issue of the fuel, they would have been able to leave, and the Argentine authorities would have authorized that to happen. So, I think there is a responsibility that deserves to be assessed there to hold, Argentine officials accountable for this. And I believe, Congressman, in your criminal complaint, you denounce the responsibility of Argentine public officials that allowed these things to happen.
Mariano, can I ask a follow-up question on this? Forgive me for interrupting.
Of course.
In the midst of the airplane saga, the Paraguayan government took credit for alerting other governments in the region, suggesting that it was their alert that led Uruguay to shut the airspace. And actually, just a few days ago, the president of Paraguay and his minister of intelligence received an award from the U.S. Embassy for, quote unquote, alerting countries in the region about the plane. Do you think that the Paraguayans alerted Argentina and the Argentinian government ignored their alert, or that the Paraguayans may have alerted only some governments, or are claiming credit for something that they didn't know? In other words, did Argentina know on June 6 about the threat this plane potentially posed, or they learned it only after Uruguay shut the airspace?
Well, first of all, let me say, Emanuele, that having worked in the intelligence community, or close to the intelligence community in Argentina, that there is no way on earth the Argentine intelligence community did not know that this plane was coming.
Okay.
They knew the plane was coming, and they authorized the plane to land. The plane was authorized to land, contrary to what happened in Uruguay. Look, you have the contrast there very clearly. Uruguay did not authorize the plane to go through their airspace. This plane was authorized to land. These people were authorized to come in, they were stamped in their passports, and they were authorized to leave as well. Unsuccessfully then at the end of the day, but they were authorized. I think if the Argentine intelligence community did not know about this, then we have the worst intelligence services in the world. And I don't believe that. I think this situation was known. Whether or not the Paraguayans informed, they came out very clearly, outspokenly, saying that they had alerted.
But they let the plane cross their airspace on its way to Argentina.
True. So I'm just basing it on the facts then.
Yeah.
The fact is that the plane was authorized to land, whether they had a warning from Paraguay or not, it was authorized to land. And look, the Argentine National Oil Company, YPF, which is run by government officials, by people that work, are appointed by our government, refused to refuel this plane. They refused to refuel it because they knew the plane was sanctioned. The airline was sanctioned. So if
Somebody knew.
If the intel
Yeah.
community did not know, but the Argentine oil company that is not an expert in intelligence or should not be, knew, there's something wrong there. I know also there is intelligence suggesting that the Venezuelan government had alerted the Argentine authorities that this was on their way, and that it had intentionally requested them to look the other way. That has yet to be proven, I believe, in the case. I believe your fellow Congressman Gerardo Milman has requested the court to investigate this particular
And I myself
issue,
also.
and you yourself as well. So,
And we accuse exactly the member of the intelligence community and all the people linked to the operation of the plane and to the landing and takeoff of the plane in the opportunities. My point is, I discovered that
Yes.
after
Yes.
the Uruguayan rejected.
Yes.
I am not a specialist on this. I am not following them.
Sure.
I discovered the problem and said this cannot be the right procedure.
Something is.
Something is wrong here. And we went to the justice in the secret presentation, under secret, to avoid any problems that put before the criminals the information. But something happened that nobody reacted in time. And because of that, we are going after, week after week, we went to the judge to demand more action on the issue. The truth is, the plan is there on the tarmac. And that is enough proof for myself that something very wrong happened. Now, maybe the international cooperation has not worked exactly perfectly, and that explains why the judge has not been able yet to accuse in a criminal way the member of
the crew.
Of the crew.
Yeah. I want to, first of all, let me just summarize. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there was a mission taking flight, and that the mission, whatever it was interrupted sort of mid-flight, if you like. Does anybody want to quickly speculate what the mission could have been that clearly was foiled? Any quick?
Well, what I find most plausible is that the cargo, so the content of the merchandise that the plane carries around the world is not what we should be focusing on. We should focus first. It doesn't mean that they are not ever carrying anything wrong, but I think we should focus mostly, or first and foremost, on why the crew is composed of such senior people. Why are they there? The cargo operation allows crews to fly around the world and get into countries under guise of being pilots and stewards and technicians and so on, and the visa restrictions are waived basically for the time they're on the ground. So it allows them to connect with local people, meet people, to maybe exchange information or carry funds, materials, equipment, what have you. So we should look into why they're going around countries. It's obvious that at least some of the flights that Emtrasur did to Nicaragua, to Cuba, to Myanmar, to Moscow, are political in nature. They're not making money out of transporting merchandise. They're there for political reasons. And so the question is, what were they doing in Ciudad del Este 3 days in mid-May, 3 days after Pecci was assassinated? What are they doing 3 weeks later in Buenos Aires?
Well, we're all going to watch this space. In the remaining time that we have, I want to turn to something that had been touched on in the panel, and that is the AMIA bombing. The New York Times had a piece recently that made headlines not only in Argentina, but also, not surprisingly, around the world. After all, it's the New York Times. And the article, if I may say, had some internal inconsistencies that I think careful readers would have maybe noticed, making them question whether the article was fully accurate. But the headlines are often what grabs people's attention. As a student of the AMIA bombing myself, I humbly note that I found the article had many gaps and ran counter to at least what I had learned over many years that was shown in the case. I'm not sure what happened with this particular article, but on July 28th, there was another article that had, I would say, a little bit more fulsome accounting, and that was an article in Infobae, which is the most widely read Spanish language publication. Essentially, the article said that there apparently is no new information that contradicts what Alberto Nisman's investigations found. This is my question to the panel, why so many years later are these sorts of things so important to correct? What's at stake here in fully understanding Iran's role in the AMIA? That's why I'm pointing to these stories. Why is it so important to correct the record on things that happened 28 and 30 years ago today? Is it because approximately half of the, half a dozen or so people indicted in a plot to cover up Iran's role in the AMIA bombing serve in the current government? Or is it something else? By the way, I should mention that the people who were indicted have not been convicted, that the case is still going through the courts, and they assert their innocence. I think it's important to say that. What's the reason that getting clarity on this issue is so important? Mariano?
Happy to take that question. I think it's important because there is no doubt, according to the evidence and the facts in the case, of Iran's responsibility in these attacks. Prosecutor Nisman conducted serious efforts to collect information that is now incorporated into the case on this involvement. We talked a little bit about that here. Rabbani's role. At the end of the day, an attaché of the Iranian embassy in Argentina. He was responsible for things, for instance, also such as collecting money that was wired from Iran and that touched upon different financial centers, landed in Argentine banks days or maybe a couple of weeks before the attacks took place. There is absolutely no doubt, I think, from the evidence collected that Iran masterminded the attacks, coordinated, possibly also financed, and in my view, participated in operational aspects as well. Receiving money, providing money, buying the van, purchasing the van that perpetrated the attacks. Are in those operational aspects of the execution of the attack? Yes, the suicide bomber was a member of Hezbollah, and it was Hezbollah who executed them. But there is no doubt about Iran's involvement here, and I think it's important to get those facts correct, particularly as the world also discusses the possibility of entering into a new nuclear deal with Iran. Iran is not only a potential nuclear threat to the world, but it's also a terrorist threat. It's a state sponsor of terrorism. Its malign activities involve threats that are not only related with the nuclear aspect, but also with the terrorist angle, with the threat to global peace and security from the terrorist side. And it's important to establish that correctly as we contemplate all the potential concessions that a potential new deal for Iran could involve.
My point there is maybe clarify one point that at least myself has not clear before, that Hezbollah display and disseminate all through Latin America. That was not so clear before, and now we have cleared that fact, and the development of cultural and religious action, and then social action, and then the network that goes through families, through friends or other mechanisms that is a very dangerous thing for our countries. And you have to have in mind that the ideology of a theocratic country, not only an authoritarian country, a theocratic country, that the religion is identified with the state, is just the opposite to open and free society. Because if the state is in the ownership of a religion, you cannot be against that. And that is a key development, because that explains why we had to be so careful. We were not intelligence officers. We discovered the problem after the Uruguayan reject the airspace to the plane. But when we put together all the things and we remember what has happened in our countries, we have to act. And that explains why we are demanding the government, and if they collaborate or not, but the evidence is very clear that something very wrong happened in Argentina. And that is what explains our behavior and our position before the judge.
Toby, if I may, just to complement, in the AMIA case, you mentioned correctly the defendants have not been found yet guilty, but they are designated as terrorists for the Argentine government. They are registered. The people, the Iranians with the red notices out there, some of whom are members of the current Iranian administration, are designated as terrorists under the public registry of terrorist suspects in Argentina. That's an important thing to say. And also, in relation with what the congressman was just saying in the context of the case, I think if we are able to establish that this mission, this transaction, was connected with, in some way or another, the provision of material support to the IRGC, to Hezbollah in particular, because it's a terrorist organization for us, or to any of these terrorists that are designated by our country as such, we have a case there that can uphold and sustain an accusation for at least for terrorist financing. And in my view, the evidence already collected in the case, which could be, of course, supported with further international cooperation, but the evidence collected already in the case is very close to being able to establish that.
I have a closing question. I was in Argentina when the JCPOA was being negotiated, and I was told by an American official in Argentina that Iran did not need to be tried in a court of law in Argentina for the bombing of the AMIA, only in a court of public opinion. I gasped, because I've talked to people who are family members of those who were killed, and here's my question. Whatever the merits or pitfalls are of a nuclear deal, does it concern you that the U.S. and perhaps others who want to see a nuclear deal inked with Iran will look the other way when it comes to nuclear malign activities? In other words, is Iran sort of testing the world to see whether the passage of time for terrorist attacks it committed in Argentina and for malign activities elsewhere has eroded its commitment to accountability and transparency? Is that what Iran is counting on, that the passage of time will erode our sense of commitment to this? And by the way, I should say you can answer this or use this as an opportunity to provide a minute of sort of closing comments, things that you haven't had a chance to say.
I'll answer that and close for the rest of the day, for my part. It does concern me a lot. It concerns me a lot because Iran represents different levels of threats. It represents a potential nuclear threat for sure, and I understand the good intentions behind the idea of a nuclear deal in that regard. But it also represents a terrorist threat. It represents a threat to global peace and security. It also represents a threat to financial integrity, to the contamination of our global financial markets with money that could be connected with these terrorist activities. And it represents a threat to the stability of the democratic order of regions, in this case of Latin American countries. So I think those issues should not be underestimated and should not be left out of the assessment. I am an expert on financial integrity issues, and I've participated in several discussions related with the threat that Iran represents to the integrity of global financial markets. Our government, under the leadership of President Macri, interacted with the U.S. administration, the previous one, in working at the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, to reestablish the countermeasures against Iran. Mm-hmm. In other words, to get Iran back on the blacklist of the FATF. Because under the previous nuclear deal, one of the consequences of that deal was that Iran had been removed from the blacklist into a sort of gray list type of situation, or some people called it dark gray. Hopefully this will not happen again, because that threat to the financial integrity of our global financial markets is there. Bringing Iran out of the blacklist would allow Iran to regain access to global financial markets, to finance itself and its operations freely without any obstacles, and that would empower also the other threats that the regime represents, particularly on the terrorist side. So I think these are issues that should be seriously taken into consideration and assessed comprehensively when we discuss the potential of a new nuclear deal.
Congressman, and then Emanuele.
Yes, I want to make it three concluding remarks. First of all, it's a problem of national defense for all the countries in Latin America to be careful about all the relation between Iran and Venezuela, Iran and Nicaragua. I have to remember everyone that in the inauguration of the last period of the regime of Ortega Murillo, one of those that is under investigation in Argentina was in the ceremony.
Resai.
Yes, and unfortunately our ambassador was present
as
there.
well.
The key for our national defense is, in my view, two things. First of all, to control very well the financial linkage. That is more simple. That is the bottleneck of the terrorist action, and we have to go there to be very careful. And second, to control our borders and mainly our trade and our in harbors or in airports. That is the main task of our intelligence service, because it's a national defense against a threat.
Correct.
That in our case we suffered two terrorist attacks. The second point that I want to underline is these ideas of a theocratic society linked with very authoritarian and totalitarian ideas in Latin America. I cannot understand why, after so many failures, so terrible performance in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, people in our countries believe that this can be a way for the future. I cannot understand, but it is very clear for us that we have to highlight, with this case, the relationship between this type of threat we suffer. And third, the fight for freedom is not a fight that you can put aside. You have to fight for freedom every day. And you have to fight for freedom because it's the only way to have a real life. And freedom is not only affected by your own government and for your own problems inside the country, but also by terrorist organization that has linkage with closed societies that are against freedom and against the values that we defend during all our life. I am very old now, and I can say for a very long period of time, all through Latin America, I have been fighting for freedom, and freedom is perhaps the main message of modernity. If you look what makes the countries prosper and develop is freedom. Without freedom, it's impossible to be successful. And that is my final say.
Thank you. And Emanuele, you have the closing word.
Well, it's hard to match what's just been said by my two colleagues. I can only second what they said. I'd just like to add that if history is prologue, then we do need to worry that under the guise of an agreement that should be narrow and focus only on non-proliferation and arms control, we may actually get a completely different posture by Western governments vis-a-vis Iran, opening of commerce, opening of trade, loosening up of controls, and a wider tolerance for those aspects of Iran's malign behavior that have nothing to do with the nuclear file. The nuclear file would make those aspects more dramatic, as one of the foremost experts on non-proliferation, an expert from France, always used to say, if you like the way Hezbollah behaves now, you're going to love it when Iran has nuclear weapons, because that would give Iran even more deterrence to protect. But if we trade if we create a trade-off for Iran where we put some, albeit limited, constraints on its nuclear program and allow it to continue with its malign activities, then we're going to end much worse off. We need not lose sight of those activities. We did it in the Cold War. We reached non-proliferation and arms control agreements with the Soviet Union without losing sight of the fact that the Soviet Union was the heart of darkness, was an empire of evil. It had engineered famines and deported millions of people and committed cultural genocide and was, supporting oppression all over the world. And we continue to combat its advance while negotiating those treaties. We can do the same with Iran, and that is my hope.
Thank you very much for those very thoughtful and informative and compelling remarks. I really appreciate them. Let me just tell our audience that this is work that FDD does throughout the year. I encourage people to visit our website, fdd.org, to learn more about our work on Iran's penetration into Latin America, Iran's all aspects really of U.S.-Iran policy. And with that, thanks very much for joining us.